It is an honor, a privilege for me to invite Professor Gabriel Ben-Dor, who's going to speak about the social component of our national resilience, which perhaps complements what Professor Melnick contributed to us just beforehand. Professor Gabi Ben-Dor, he is the head of national security studies at Haifa University and at the school, and he's also the head of the School of Political Sciences. And he was also rector of the faculty. Both Professor Rafi Melnick and Professor Gabi Ben-Dor, with both of them rectors at 2 universities, and they have always been excellent in providing us these indices. Professor Gabi Ben-Dor, the floor is yours. Good evening. The president, the dean, the head of the institute. Good evening, one and all, and especially to the Chief of Staff of the Greek Army. I would like to thank Professor Melnick for his immense contribution, but I would like to share with you a rather tough experience, because when I was invited, by the way, my time is running out, oh dear. When I was invited, a letter was written to me, and they explained to me the limited time, and they said, because we've got 150 speakers at the conference, so even if you're sitting at 3 panels for 3 days, you're going to hear maybe 50 talks. So what can I do, I thought myself, so that someone will listen to me and perhaps even internalize something, and maybe, God forbid, they might even remember something that I say. So I decided to generate a drastic change from my previous years, if you remember them. Instead of flooding you with data, I'm going to bring you some basic central thesis about the various trends in my indices, and of course I will back them with data, and then I will actually share 3 puzzles with you that I didn't succeed in solving. And so I would like to first share this experience with you. The state of Israel, and I'd like to say something very surprising, at the moment is at it's the zenith, at the peak of its optimism in an unprecedented way. The Jews and the minorities for over 17 years. At the moment, this is a peak with the Israelis, but also with the minorities. And we are not, we do not see that when we read the papers, listening to the radio, watching television. It's not something that we can actually sort of absorb when we do. And I think that that's something that must be mentioned. And even intuitively, if it doesn't seem right, and even controversial to what we may think, our public is still optimistic. Why is this surprising? Because as we go along, you'll see that the public doesn't think that the dangers have sort of decreased, and they don't have trust in their leaders. There's no reason, basically, according to the indices, to be optimistic. And yet, despite all that, they are optimistic. So I'd like to give you a hypothesis about why I think that this is happening, but that's a little bit later on. In addition to that, I would like to already say, just have a look at the gap between the Jews and the Arabs, which is not so great. And the level of national optimism amongst the minorities is higher relatively to the fact that they are in a state of actual conflict. Now look at that, look at the level of patriotism of the Jews and the minorities. With the Jews, it's pretty sort of level and stable. They're always very patriotic, they always were and they always will be. But with the Arabs, you can see all sorts of real sort of drastic ups and downs and fluctuations. But you can see a very clear increase over the last few years. So the level of the patriotism of the minorities, of the Israeli Arabs, is actually at the highest point it's ever been before. And the gap, as you can see, between the Jews and the minorities is actually being bridged. Now that is in contrast to everything else that we've heard. For example, you've heard not only the daily news, but you hear all sort of very scholarly talks about the Palestinization of the Israeli Arabs. Well, I'd like to tell you, yes, Palestinization is actually happening. But with a significant part of with the Arab public, the tension or the actual contrast between the Israelization and the Palestinization is actually happening at a much lower level than actually what it appears to us. So many of the the Arabs are internalizing their Israeli identity, but not waiving or ceding their Palestinian identity. But the fact that this Palestinization is so significant that we should learn many a lesson from that. And now the second puzzle that I'm not sure that I'll be able to solve in the next few minutes, if that high level of patriotism exists amongst the minorities in the state of Israel, and so many of them, even if they identify with the Palestinians, still see themselves, envision themselves as Israelis, and just look at the words that we ask them. Are you proud to be in the state of Israel? Do you condemn Israel in the United Nations? This is very clear words, and these are the answers. So if it is as such, why is this not manifest in the Knesset? Why are the leaders of the Arab political parties are not there? There's a big gap, and it needs to be explained. But it's really something that stands out and is very prominent here. In addition to that, I'd like to say, look what I'm doing here. I am a scholar of the Raymond Aron, of the great French scholar. He says that one must always ask what is different and what you think is similar, and what is similar and what seems to you very different. And I'd like to compare it to previous periods and various groups of the population in the state of Israel. In the next 8-9 minutes, I'm going to share that with you. Now look at the militancy kind of index. In other words, if we're talking about the support of forceful activity or the use of force in military. Now the state of Israel, you can see, if you look at the Jews, never have they been, I mean, it's still in a high index, by the way, don't misunderstand, but it's lower than it ever has been. In other words, the level of militancy of the state of Israel is on a decrease. In other words, their readiness to actually hold arms is much lower. You can see that as something positive or something negative. It depends what your liberal view of the world is, whether you are nationalistic or not, etc. So therefore, I think that this is very surprising, and that is my third puzzle. The question is why? Why is it as such? After all, what is happening in the state of Israel, as you'll see as we go along, that amongst all the elites, the one that is most supported is the security elite in the state of the state of Israel. So on one hand, there's a kind of stream of militarism, of belief and faith and confidence in the sort of the IDF and the military forces. Really, it's a kind of elite that everyone believes on. But why don't we want them to use what they have accessible to them? In other words, their arms. Perhaps I'll share that as we go along. And I'd now also like to speak about some other prominent issues. Here it is really perhaps very sad, and perhaps it connects to what Professor Melnick said about governance and democracy. What you can see from the point of view of the trust and confidence in our political institutions, Jews and minorities. If we're talking about the confidence and the trust in the political institutes, you can see that it was 2.96, and now it's gone down to 2.91. So if we're talking about, if we think that there was some kind of recovery, okay, there was over a few years, but after now in May 2017, you can see that it's gone down again. In other words, there is less confidence in the politicals, in the politicians, much less so than they did sort of a generation ago. Now, look what has happened to these figures between the Jews and the minorities. Look, the numbers are nearly identical. You can barely see a difference in the lines. Even if those government institutions and the parties and the Knesset are very dominant Jewish majority, but they don't actually, and they really do belong to the Jews, but they don't feel that. And still there, you can see that in the figures, and it's manifest here, which is very positive from the point of view of Israeli democracy. Now, what about the confidence and the trust in the Supreme Court of Justice? I think, in contrast to everything I said a few moments ago, or what one can derive from what I said, the institution that had the highest level of confidence was the Supreme Court of Justice 17 years ago. The citizens of the State of Israel, Jews and Arabs, believed more in the actual Supreme Court of Justice, more so than in the IDF and the Shabak and the security forces and the police. Now it has changed totally in the other direction. You can see there's a tremendous decrease in that. And you can see the blue line. You can see the fluctuations with the minorities as well. By the way, the minorities, the red and yellow line, and the Jews is the blue line. So you can see suddenly that they are identical levels now. One must mention here, over that period of time, that the same as with the political institutions, this Supreme Court of Justice, which is of paramount importance to Israeli democracy, more or less, really it is appreciated the same, esteemed to the same degree, and believed in the same degree. You would think that the Arabs would think that, yes, they are the safeguard of the actual minorities and the weaker parts of the population, but unfortunately there's also been a kind of detrimental effect on that, and it's gone down quite a lot. And now, if we're talking about the confidence and the belief in the security forces, amongst them, again, the red line is the minorities. It's as if the public does not actually trust their, you could say that their generals and the IDF, you can see that they do, in fact, continue. And you can also see, you will have seen what happens with the minority as well. Now, let us have a look at men and women, and that is something that we never explored. People spoke about feminism before, so I'm also going to talk about that. Men and women in Israeli society. Men, by the way, are on the right-hand side of the slide, women on the left. Now, in every index, women are more frightened of terror, women are more frightened of a neighboring country assault. On the other hand, they appreciate more the politicians and the Supreme Court of Justice and the security forces. In other words, women are the more realistic in the state of Israel. They do soberly, with open eyes, see what the risks are, but they believe in the internal resilience and the basic values of society, being able to meet those needs. Now, just two more little sort of cherries. Now, if we spoke about the indices amongst the Druze, who I truly, deeply appreciate, I've written many an article about them. The Druze, like with women, all the indices are higher. Now, listen very carefully. The Druze are more patriotic than the Jews, prouder than the Jews themselves. By the way, they're on the right-hand side. They believe in the Supreme Court of Justice. They believe more in the Supreme Court of Justice and in the political institutions and establishment, but they are less militant. That, by the way, is a total contrast against their image. And I'd like to also show you this slide. You saw a tremendous crisis a few years ago, and we're talking about the patriotism of the Druze, and as a result of feeling discriminated against. But there's been a tremendous, surprising recovery. So the Druze now at the moment are at a zenith of their patriotism, more so than the Jews, which I think is an amazing finding. And the final thing, it's a shame that the two ministers have left, because I'd have liked them to have seen that. We tried to develop a coherence kind of index, and I wanted to see if there's any real significance embedded in those words and terms, left-wing, right-wing, or centralist, and this is an actual comparison of them when we're talking about the actual resilience in indices. The Israelis are much more sophisticated in the way they elect, more so than the credit we give them for that, because you can see the right, central and left, that you can see, yes, in the right wing, as you see more of the militancy and perhaps patriotism, but you also see less of their confidence in the actual Supreme Court of Justice, but more so in the security forces. But here you can see the Likud on the right-hand side, and then Kulanu, and then Yesh Atid, and then the Labour Party, or what we call the Zionist camp, the Machaneh HaTzioni. So, for example, Kachalan's party, that's the Minister of Finance, he's a sort of a centrist right-wing party. You can see that there isn't such an enormous difference between his voters and those who voted for Yesh Atid. Now, who puts a white ballot in the box on election day? It's usually left and central. The voters of Likud will go, and the religious parties will usually go, But for those who did, of course, that is why the result of the elections were as they were. So 3 solutions of the puzzles that I spoke about. The first puzzle was, why are the Jews less militant when they still do believe in their security establishment, because they believe that the leaders of that establishment are also less militant. Think about it for a moment. I haven't got time to develop it. Secondly, why does the Arab public vote for people that they don't really identify with from the point of view of their basic values, simply because they haven't got other institutions? One of the reasons was that the Jews should have actually developed much more integrative parties in order to create that kind of equilibrium, but we won't be able to do that without collaboration. If you enjoyed it, I'm really happy. If not, then you should be ashamed of yourselves, because I thought that this was an extraordinary finding. This is the 16th or 17th time that I have actually come here. Last year, for various reasons, I wasn't able to appear. So I'm now thinking about a French and English proverb that explains the fact that I am here tonight. The English one says that the criminal always goes back to where the crime arena is, and the French proverb says that a Frenchman always goes back to the place he found true love for the first time.